The call came through to the 19th Precinct at 9:47 a.m. on a frost-brittle morning in February 2019, when the streets of Manhattan's Upper East Side still glittered with ice from the previous night's storm. Detective Marcus Hayes was 3 sips into his coffee when the dispatch operator's voice crackled through, reporting a missing person at a residential building on East 76th Street between Lexington and 3rd Avenue. Hayes, a 22-year veteran with the NYPD, who'd worked everything from drug busts in Washington Heights to white-collar fraud cases in the financial district, felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came with certain types of calls. Missing persons in New York City were complicated. 8 million people moving through the urban maze meant that disappearances could be voluntary departures, tragic accidents, or something far darker. The city swallowed people whole sometimes, and occasionally, it gave them back. He grabbed his partner, Detective Lisa Ramirez, a sharp-eyed investigator from the Bronx who'd transferred to Manhattan 3 years earlier with a reputation for finding connections others missed. They drove through slushy streets where morning commuters hurried past steaming subway grates, the city's perpetual motion machine, already running at full speed. The building on East 76th was one of those pre-war structures that gave the Upper East Side its character. 6 stories of red brick, with ornate cornices and a marble lobby that spoke of old money and established residents. The doorman, a Puerto Rican man in his 60s named Carlos Martinez, met them in the vestibule with worry etched across his features like cracks in old porcelain. Sarah Chen had lived in apartment 4B for 9 years, Carlos explained as he led them to the elevator. She was 36 years old, worked as a senior analyst at Goldman Sachs, lived alone since her divorce 3 years prior. Every weekday morning at exactly 6:45 a.m., she emerged from her apartment in business attire, always nodded to Carlos, always caught the 702 subway at 77th Street. Her life ran on precision timing, the kind of clockwork routine that successful Manhattan professionals built their existence around. That morning, Sarah's assistant had called the building at 9:30 after Sarah failed to show up for an important presentation to potential investors, calls to her cell going straight to voicemail. This wasn't just unusual, Carlos stressed as the elevator climbed. This was impossible. Sarah Chen didn't miss meetings. She didn't ignore phone calls. She definitely didn't vanish without explanation. The woman who answered the door to 4B was Sarah's younger sister, Jennifer Chen, who'd arrived 30 minutes earlier, using the spare key Sarah had given her years ago. Jennifer was 32, a pediatric resident at Mount Sinai, and her composure was barely holding against the rising tide of panic that Hayes recognized from hundreds of family notifications over his career. Inside, apartment 4B looked like a page from Architectural Digest, minimalist furniture in grays and whites, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a courtyard, abstract art on the walls. Everything spoke of controlled taste and substantial income. But what struck Hayes immediately was the absence of chaos. No overturned furniture, no signs of struggle, no indication that anything violent had occurred in this carefully curated space. Sarah's coffee maker sat on the kitchen counter with fresh grounds in the filter, never turned on. Her laptop was closed on the dining table, power cord wrapped neatly beside it. Her winter coat, a black wool Burberry that probably cost more than Hayes made in a week, hung in the entryway closet. Her work bag sat beside the door, laptop sleeve empty. Jennifer explained through barely controlled trembling that she'd found the apartment exactly like this. The bed was made with the kind of precision you'd expect in a hotel. The bathroom was spotless. Sarah's phone wasn't here, nor were her keys or wallet. But her medication, the antidepressants she'd been taking since the divorce, sat in the medicine cabinet with yesterday's dose still in the weekly organizer. Hayes walked through the apartment with the methodical attention that separated experienced detectives from rookies who rushed to conclusions. He noted the details that painted a picture of a life interrupted mid-sentence. A book on the nightstand, bookmark at page 47. A wine glass in the dish rack, washed and dried. Gym clothes laid out on a chair, suggesting Sarah had planned to work out after her presentation. The apartment's second bedroom had been converted into a home office. Ramirez examined it while Hayes continued his sweep. The desk held financial documents, printouts of market analyses, sticky notes with reminders about upcoming deadlines. Nothing suggested Sarah was planning to disappear, and nothing suggested she'd had help leaving. It was when Hayes checked the apartment's sole balcony that he found the first anomaly. The sliding glass door was unlocked, which Jennifer insisted was wrong, because Sarah was meticulous about security, always checking locks before bed. The balcony was small, just enough room for 2 chairs and a potted plant that had died from winter exposure. 4 stories up, overlooking the courtyard shared by the building and its neighbors. Hayes stepped onto the balcony, felt the February wind cut through his jacket. He looked down at the courtyard below, where patches of dirty snow clung to landscaped areas, and a decorative fountain sat frozen and dormant for winter. Then he looked up at the fire escape that zigzagged down the building's facade, ending 1 floor above Sarah's balcony. Ramirez joined him, following his gaze. The fire escape's lowest ladder, the retractable kind designed to prevent ground-level access, hung extended toward Sarah's balcony, not touching it, but close enough that someone athletic and determined could potentially swing across the gap. They went downstairs to examine the courtyard. Carlos the doorman accompanied them, explaining that the courtyard was accessible only to building residents, secured by locked gates on both the 76th and 77th Street sides. The gates used keycard access, and the system logged every entry. Carlos pulled up the records on his phone, scrolling through the previous 24 hours. No entries to the courtyard between 11 p.m. the previous night and 6 a.m. that morning. Hayes crouched near the fountain, studying the ground. The snow here had been disturbed, footprints leading from the building's rear entrance toward the fire escape. He photographed them with his phone, noting the size and tread pattern. Men's boots, size 10 or 11, distinct zigzag pattern on the soles. The footprint stopped at the base of the fire escape. Hayes looked up again at the ladder hanging extended, at Sarah's balcony with its unlocked door. He felt the case beginning to take shape in his mind, like a photograph developing in a dark room. Back in the precinct, Hayes and Ramirez began the systematic work that solved cases. They pulled Sarah's phone records, credit card statements, bank transactions. They interviewed her coworkers at Goldman Sachs, her ex-husband who'd remarried and moved to Connecticut, her friends from her yoga class in Soho, her therapist who they reached through Jennifer's authorization. The picture that emerged was of a woman who'd rebuilt her life after divorce with determined focus. She worked 12-hour days, cultivated a small circle of close friends, spent weekends at museums or reading in Central Park. No romantic relationship since the divorce. No enemies that anyone could identify. No financial problems despite the expensive Manhattan lifestyle. No indication of mental health crisis despite the antidepressants she took with her therapist's supervision. Her phone records showed the last activity at 10:47 p.m. the previous night, a text to Jennifer about meeting for brunch that weekend. After that, nothing. The phone either powered down or destroyed, its last known location in the vicinity of Sarah's apartment. Her credit cards showed no activity after a charge at a Whole Foods near her office at 6:15 p.m. the previous evening. Her bank account showed no withdrawals, no unusual transfers, nothing to suggest she'd been planning to run. Hayes assigned uniformed officers to canvass the neighborhood, showing Sarah's photo to every doorman, every bodega owner, every person who worked the night shift in the surrounding blocks. A city of 8 million people, but neighborhoods were villages where the same faces appeared in the same patterns, where regulars were noticed and strangers remembered. The breakthrough came on day 3, from an unlikely source. A Columbia University student named Marcus Webb had been walking home to his dorm on 77th Street at approximately 1:30 a.m. on the night Sarah disappeared. He'd cut through the alley behind Sarah's building, a shortcut he used regularly despite the darkness and the fact that it technically belonged to the building's service entrance. Marcus hadn't thought much about what he'd seen until detectives showed up at the Columbia campus asking questions. Then he remembered the van. Dark-colored, maybe blue or black, hard to tell under the sodium streetlights. It had been idling in the alley with its back doors open, which struck Marcus as odd because it was 1:30 in the morning and the temperature was hovering around 20 degrees. He'd seen a figure standing near the van's rear, but not clearly enough to provide useful description. Male, probably, medium build, wearing dark clothing. Marcus had assumed it was a late-night delivery, the kind of thing that happened in Manhattan at strange hours and had kept walking. Now, 3 days later, that van felt significant in ways he couldn't articulate. Hayes and Ramirez pulled security footage from every camera they could find within a 6-block radius. New York was a surveillance city, thousands of cameras recording millions of hours of mundane activity, waiting for the moment when something significant appeared in frame. They found the van on footage from a bodega camera on 3rd Avenue. Dark blue, older model, Ford Transit. Commercial plates, partially obscured by deliberate smudging. It appeared at 1:17 a.m., drove slowly past the bodega, turned onto 76th Street towards Sarah's building. 12 minutes later, it appeared again on the same camera, heading in the opposite direction, moving faster now, with purpose. The license plate, despite the smudging, was partially visible. Ramirez enhanced the image using software that felt like something from a science fiction movie, pulling details from pixels that looked meaningless to the naked eye. The first 3 characters became clear enough to run through DMV databases. The search returned 47 vehicles matching those partial plates. Hayes and Ramirez began the tedious work of elimination, cross-referencing owners against databases of known offenders, checking for connections to Sarah or her building or the Upper East Side. 39 vehicles were eliminated within hours, owners with solid alibis or no apparent connection to the case. Vehicle number 43 stopped Hayes mid-scroll through his computer screen. The van was registered to a business called Metropolitan Property Services, a company that contracted with building management firms across Manhattan to handle maintenance, repairs, and renovation work. The company's address was in Long Island City, Queens, operating out of a warehouse district near the waterfront. Ramirez pulled up Metropolitan Property Services' client list, obtained through a warrant that a judge approved with unusual speed given the circumstances of Sarah's disappearance. Her fingers stopped on page 3 of the company's contracts. Metropolitan Property Services had been hired 6 months earlier to perform facade restoration work on the building at East 76th Street, where Sarah Chen lived. The work had been completed in November, but the contract included a maintenance clause requiring periodic inspections of the restored sections. Company records showed an inspection scheduled for February 12th, the day after Sarah disappeared. Hayes felt the familiar electricity that came when a case shifted from mystery to solvable problem. Someone at Metropolitan Property Services had legitimate access to Sarah's building, knowledge of its layout and security systems, and a van that had been in the alley at 1:30 a.m. on the night she vanished. They drove to Long Island City as the sun set over Manhattan's skyline, turning the glass towers into mirrors reflecting gold and orange light. The warehouse district was quieter here, industrial buildings giving way to artist lofts and new developments, but Metropolitan Property Services occupied an old structure that predated gentrification. 3 stories of weathered brick with roll-up doors and scaffolding stored in the yard. The company's owner, a man named Vincent Russo, met them in an office that smelled of coffee and sawdust. He was 62 years old, had run the business for 35 years, and his confusion at detectives appearing seemed genuine. As Hayes explained, they needed information about employees who'd worked on the East 76th Street building. Russo pulled up records on a computer that looked older than some of Hayes' colleagues. 4 employees had been assigned to the facade restoration project. 3 were longtime workers, men Russo had employed for over a decade, all with clean backgrounds and references that checked out immediately. The 4th employee was different. His name was Daniel Thornton, 34 years old, hired 8 months ago through a temp agency that specialized in construction labor. He'd worked on the 76th Street project for 6 weeks, always showing up on time, always completing assigned tasks. Quiet guy, Russo said, kept to himself but did solid work. No complaints from building management, no issues with other crew members. But when Hayes asked if Daniel Thornton had access to a company van, Russo's expression shifted to something uncomfortable. Thornton had been assigned to equipment runs occasionally, picking up supplies or dropping off tools at different job sites. He had keys to van number 7, the blue Ford Transit. And yes, Russo admitted with visible reluctance, Thornton had taken the van on February 11th for what he claimed was an emergency supply run for a project in Brooklyn. Ramirez asked for Daniel Thornton's address. Russo provided it, along with a phone number that went straight to a disconnected message when Hayes tried calling. The address was in Washington Heights, a sixth-floor walk-up on 187th Street in a neighborhood where Hayes had worked his first years as a detective. Russo pulled up records on a computer that looked older than some of Hayes' colleagues. 4 employees had been assigned to the facade restoration project. 3 were longtime workers, men Russo had employed for over a decade, all with clean backgrounds and references that checked out immediately. The 4th employee was different. His name was Daniel Thornton, 34 years old, hired 8 months ago through a temp agency that specialized in construction labor. He'd worked on the 76th Street project for 6 weeks, always showing up on time, always completing assigned tasks. Quiet guy, Russo said, kept to himself, but did solid work. No complaints from building management, no issues with other crew members. But when Hayes asked if Daniel Thornton had access to a company van, Russo's expression shifted to something uncomfortable. Thornton had been assigned to equipment runs occasionally, picking up supplies or dropping off tools at different job sites. He had keys to van number 7, the blue Ford Transit. And yes, Russo admitted with visible reluctance, Thornton had taken the van on February 11th for what he claimed was an emergency supply run for a project in Brooklyn. Ramirez asked for Daniel Thornton's address. Russo provided it, along with a phone number that went straight to a disconnected message when Hayes tried calling. The address was in Washington Heights, a 6th-floor walk-up on 187th Street, in a neighborhood where Hayes had worked his first years as a detective. They requested backup and a warrant, then drove uptown, as the city transitioned from day to night. Lights coming on in millions of windows. The urban landscape transforming into something that looked beautiful from a distance, but harbored darkness in its intimate spaces. The building on 187th Street was everything the Upper East Side wasn't. Graffiti tagged the entrance, the elevator broken with a handwritten sign directing residents to stairs that smelled of urine and fried food. Hayes, Ramirez, and 4 uniformed officers climbed 6 flights, their footsteps echoing in the stairwell. Apartment 6C's door was closed but not locked. Hayes knocked, announced police presence, received no response. He pushed the door open onto a studio apartment that looked like a monk's cell. Mattress on the floor, milk crates serving as furniture, a hot plate on a counter with crusted food residue. No decorations, no personal items, nothing to suggest anyone actually lived here beyond bare survival. But in the apartment's single closet, behind clothes hanging on a metal rod, they found something that made Hayes' pulse accelerate. A wooden crate, approximately 3 feet by 2 feet, with rope handles on either side. The kind of crate used for moving or storage, sturdy enough to transport weight. Ramirez photographed the crate from every angle before Hayes opened it. Inside, wrapped in plastic sheeting, were women's clothes. A gray business suit with subtle pinstripes. A white silk blouse, black heels, size 7. A leather handbag containing a wallet with credit cards and a driver's license. Sarah Chen's driver's license, her face staring up from the laminated card with the slight smile people wore for DMV photos. Hayes felt cold despite the apartment's stifling heat. From radiators the tenant couldn't control, the clothes were folded with care, almost reverence. The plastic sheeting was the kind used in construction, the same material Metropolitan Property Services would have access to on job sites. They found more in a cardboard box shoved under the mattress. Photographs, dozens of them, taken with a telephoto lens. Sarah Chen walking to the subway. Sarah Chen sitting at a coffee shop window. Sarah Chen on her balcony, visible from the building across the courtyard where someone could watch without being seen. The photos dated back months, tracking her routines with obsessive attention. And beneath the photographs, they found a journal. Daniel Thornton's journal, filled with handwriting that started neat and controlled in early entries, but deteriorated into frantic scrawls as the pages progressed. Hayes read excerpts that chilled him. Thornton had convinced himself that Sarah was meant to be with him, that their connection transcended normal relationship boundaries, that she was sending him signals through the way she dressed, or moved, or glanced in his direction. Classic stalker delusions, The kind that turned workplace proximity into imagined romance and rejection into justification for violence. The final entry was dated February 10th, the day before Sarah disappeared. It described a plan. Thornton had realized during the facade restoration work that Sarah's balcony was accessible via the fire escape if someone was willing to take the risk. He'd been watching her apartment at night, timing her routines, noting when she turned off lights and presumably went to bed. He decided that February 11th would be the night he finally made contact, finally made Sarah understand their connection. Ramirez found more evidence in the apartment's tiny bathroom: latex gloves, the kind construction workers used, a roll of duct tape, zip ties still in their packaging, and something that made her call Hayes immediately: a second cell phone, a cheap burner with a single number in its call history. Hayes dialed the number, not expecting answer, but needing to try. After 4 rings, a man's voice answered, cautious and guarded. Hayes identified himself as NYPD, explained he was investigating a missing person case, asked who he was speaking with. The man on the other end hesitated, then provided a name that Hayes recognized from their earlier investigation: Kyle Morrison, one of the 3 longtime employees at Metropolitan Property Services who'd worked on the 76th Street facade restoration. Morrison's initial denials crumbled quickly when Hayes mentioned they'd found the burner phone in Daniel Thornton's apartment. Yes, Morrison admitted. Thornton had called him on February 12th, the day after Sarah's disappearance. Thornton had sounded panicked, said he'd made a terrible mistake, needed help. He'd asked Morrison to help him access a storage unit, to use Morrison's name on the rental agreement, because Thornton didn't want anything traced back to him. Morrison swore he hadn't known what was in the storage unit, hadn't asked questions because Thornton had paid him $500 in cash to sign the rental agreement, and then forget about it. The storage facility was in the Bronx, on Webster Avenue near Fordham Road, unit number 47. Hayes and Ramirez drove to the Bronx through night traffic, their urgency communicating itself to surrounding drivers who moved aside when the unmarked car's lights and siren activated. The storage facility was one of those massive structures that lined industrial corridors, fluorescent lights making the hallways feel like something from a dystopian movie. The facility manager opened Unit 47 with a master key after Hayes showed the warrant. The roll-up door rose with a metallic clatter that echoed through the corridor. Inside, the unit was mostly empty, except for a single item in the center: a blue plastic tarp wrapped around something approximately human-sized, secured with rope that had been tied with the practiced knots of someone who worked with their hands. Hayes didn't need to open the tarp to know what they'd found, but procedure demanded it. Ramirez stepped back as Hayes pulled on latex gloves and carefully unwrapped the plastic layers. Sarah Chen's face emerged, pale and still, her eyes closed as if sleeping. The medical examiner would later determine she'd died from asphyxiation, duct tape over her mouth, and zip ties around her wrists, suggesting she'd been restrained and unable to breathe. The investigation into Daniel Thornton's whereabouts became a manhunt that involved multiple precincts and federal resources. His burner phone records showed calls to a number in Pennsylvania, which led to an aunt who hadn't seen him in years, but confirmed he'd mentioned going to Canada if things ever got bad. Border Patrol was notified. Airports received alerts. Thornton's face appeared on news broadcasts and social media, transforming him from anonymous construction worker into the most wanted man in New York. They found him 4 days later at a truck stop outside Buffalo, 70 miles from the Canadian border. He'd been sleeping in a stolen car, living on gas station food, looking nothing like the neat professional who'd appeared in Metropolitan Property Services employee files. When New York State Police surrounded the vehicle, Thornton didn't resist, just sat with his hands on the steering wheel and stared straight ahead. Hayes and Ramirez drove to Buffalo to conduct the interrogation, 6 hours upstate through winter landscape that looked nothing like Manhattan's urban density. In an interview room at the state police barracks, Daniel Thornton began to talk. He described watching Sarah for months during the facade restoration work, convinced that she felt the same connection he did, despite never having spoken to her beyond basic greetings. He'd planned for weeks to make contact, to show her that they were meant to be together. On February 11th, He'd climbed the fire escape at 1 a.m., swung across to Sarah's balcony, jimmied the sliding door lock with tools from his construction job. He'd entered her apartment expecting to talk, to explain his feelings, to make her understand. Sarah had woken up when he entered her bedroom. She'd screamed, tried to reach for her phone. Thornton had panicked, grabbed her, covered her mouth to stop the noise. He'd zip-tied her wrists, duct-taped her mouth, carried her down the fire escape to where his van waited in the alley. The entire abduction took less than 10 minutes in the early morning darkness, when even New York City briefly slept. He'd driven her to his apartment in Washington Heights, kept her in the wooden crate for hours while he tried to figure out what to do next. But Sarah had suffocated during transport or shortly after. Thornton wasn't sure which. When he finally opened the crate, she was dead. Everything after that was improvisation and panic. He'd called Kyle Morrison, rented the storage unit, hidden Sarah's body there while he cleaned his apartment, and tried to figure out how to escape the consequences of what he'd done. The confession was recorded, transcribed, and would later be used in a trial where Daniel Thornton faced charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and improper disposal of human remains. The evidence Hayes and Ramirez had meticulously gathered, the surveillance footage and phone records and witness statements, built a case that prosecutors described as airtight. Sarah Chen's family held a funeral on a March day when early spring was trying to break through winter's grip. Jennifer Chen delivered a eulogy that reduced everyone in attendance to tears, describing her sister's kindness and brilliance and the future that had been stolen by a man whose obsession had turned deadly. The case received extensive media coverage, another tragedy in a city that generated headlines daily, but occasionally produced stories that resonated beyond the usual crime statistics. News outlets analyzed building security, discussed stalking laws, debated whether construction workers should undergo more extensive background checks before gaining access to residential buildings. For Hayes and Ramirez, the successful resolution brought no satisfaction, only the exhausted awareness that they'd done their jobs and saved a family from decades of wondering. They'd found Sarah Chen, had delivered answers even though those answers contained nothing but grief. The balcony on East 76th Street, where an unlocked door had allowed a killer entry, remained part of Sarah's apartment, now occupied by new tenants who'd negotiated a reduced rent after learning the building's history. The fire escape still zigzagged down the facade, but building management installed additional security measures, cameras, and sensors that would alert them to any unauthorized access. The case file, closed and archived, joined thousands of others in the NYPD's record system. Detective Marcus Hayes kept a copy of the main documentation in his desk drawer, occasionally taking it out late at night, when insomnia kept him at the precinct, not because he needed to review the facts, but because remembering victims like Sarah Chen felt like the only way to honor the work he did. New York City continued its perpetual motion, 8 million lives intersecting in patterns too complex to predict. Crimes would occur, investigations would follow. Some cases would be solved, while others remained mysteries. But for Sarah Chen, there would be no more wondering. The question of what happened had been answered, and while that answer brought no comfort, it brought an ending to a story that might otherwise have stretched into infinity, unresolved and haunting. Justice, when it finally arrived, couldn't resurrect the dead or restore what had been taken. It could only ensure that the guilty face consequences and that families receive the terrible gift of knowing the truth, however much that truth hurt.